a little bit more ice and do the daiquiri because we're
Yes.
to spend a lot of time on that old fashioned, which was good. Like that's like really the beginning of this whole cocktail conversation. We did want to show you an example of a shaken drink, something with citrus. Even though, you know, maybe some of us aren't doing a lot of shaken drinks at home, you know, like we were talking about before, I've definitely been all about the old fashions and tea punches over the last couple of months. So we're going to do a daiquiri, which is really kind of like the classic example of a sour. And I would argue that the template for a sour is perhaps the most adaptable within your library of classic cocktails. Drinks that you don't even think about as being sours probably are. Things like mojitos, Moscow mules.
Caipirinhas, margaritas, gimlets, sours, they're all the same drink. If you know how to make one, you can then strip it down and build it up.
So let's talk about one that's just a core, within the lens of a daiquiri, 3 components: your citrus, your sugar, and your rum. And you'll see like that's not so different than what we were talking about with the old fashioned, right? Where you had, you know, your bitter, your spirit, and your sugar. We're kind of doing the same thing here. The lime juice is actually sort of taking the place of our bitter component in a shaken drink. There's certainly no complete like hard and fast rules for shaking and stirring. Generally speaking, if you're doing a stirred drink, it means that it won't have citrus in it, although of course there are exceptions. And generally speaking, with citrus, you're doing something shaken. And this is a matter of incorporation and really a big matter of texture. The lime juice or the lemon juice is going to add a special kind of texture to your drink, and by aerating that drink, by shaking it, you're going to end up with something that is lively, a little bit bubbly. As Joaquin Simo always likes to say, a daiquiri should be served while it's still laughing at you. You know, and this is a drink that certainly can be enjoyed on the rocks, just like any sour, like a margarita, but often is enjoyed up. You know, so this isn't a drink that's going to last for a really long time in the heat. And it's going to get flat and warm in a way that's not going to be super fun. You want to have it when it still has like its best verve and it's nice and cold.
And when someone says to you at a bar, you know, like they're, you know, they sit down at a bar, sometimes you read this menu and it can be intimidating. Often the program comes before the patrons far too often, you know, and, you know, they ask the question, they're intimidated. They don't know what these ingredients are. You never, what's sfumato, whatever, you know, and you say, are you looking for something shaken or stirred? And like what you mean by that is, are you looking for something lighter and more refreshing or something boozy and more bitter?
Absolutely. Right? And I think that's a part of the language between bartender or server and guest that is definitely becoming more common these days, where they are more likely to understand that differentiation. But by all means, you know, sometimes it still has to be explained. The old fashioned and the daiquiri are really excellent ways to start that conversation. Are you in the mood for something more like an old fashioned, boozy and spirit forward, or something more like a daiquiri, really refreshing and bright and with citrus? So this is your daiquiri situation. So just like an old fashioned can be made with any number of spirits, a daiquiri can be made with any number of rums, but people, you know, but it does have to have rum in it, right? So if in my history as a bartender, if people were to ask me for a daiquiri and didn't have a preference on rum, and perhaps weren't even sure what styles of rum they enjoy, which of course at Skurnik we have so many amazing styles to choose from, I would always reach for something like Eldorado 3-year, and actually specifically I would reach for Eldorado 3-year. This is a lighter rum. It's aged but charcoal filtered, so you're not getting any sort of like big, like aggressive cane flavors. It's, you know, a little bit more delicate, has this lovely sort of like buttery popcorn note on the end. This is a crazy friendly rum. And so, you know, even the most sophisticated palate, if you make a well-executed daiquiri with a younger rum like this, a Demerara rum, they're gonna like it. Like they're not gonna be mad at it.
How do you feel about a daiquiri with rum agricole?
I love it, and we'll talk first in a second about like how you can start playing around with your rum combos within the drink. So this is a 2 3/4 3/4 template. And that was the way I was taught for like my core sour template. I know, Justin, that wasn't the way that you were taught. Adam's also shaking his head. But much like we started with a teaspoon of sugar within the old fashioned, this is just a starting point. Chances are that if you're experimenting at home and you start with a 2 3/4 3/4, so 2 ounces of your booze, 3/4 of your sugar, 3/4 of your citrus, you're going to end up with something that's not far off the mark for your personal taste. And then you can always play around with those proportions there.
Fire engines. There you go.
So we already mentioned how much we love JM cane, and I love JM cane. And actually, when I make daiquiris in general, I tend to prefer to use cane syrup. So less cane, more citrus, and I play around with this 2 3/4 recipe. But for today, we wanted to kind of do something nice and classic. So I'm just going to use some simple syrup and stick with the 2 3/4 3/4, especially since we're using a lighter rum. If we were going for a bigger rum, something like an Agricole or a Jamaican, something with more age on it, then those bigger sugars might hold up and balance that drink a little bit better. But for now, this simple syrup with white sugar is kind of like the vanilla of your seasoning cabinet. You know, it's not going to affect flavor too much. It's going to be more about finding the balance between the booze and the citrus, and it's also going to add just the right amount of mouthfeel, because you don't want a thin daiquiri. That's a sad thing as well. So this is where a shaker tin comes in real handy. Certainly historically, and when I first started bartending before cocktails were a thing in my life, Boston shakers were more of a thing, where you would have like a pint glass on one end and a larger metal tin on the back end. Of course, the metal tin on tin is nice because the temperature is going to get closer to where you want a lot faster, and you don't have to worry about breaking glasses if you're like a monster shaker and stirrer like Justin, and you tend to break your shakers and bar tools. So we're going to do tin on tin.
It's also physically lighter to hold and shake. You can get a faster whip from it more easily.
So I'm going to go ahead and measure out the stuff, and then we'll talk a little bit about shaking and ice. Again, we're starting with our least expensive ingredients first. For me, that's going to be the simple syrup. The other nice thing about this is, because I'm using the same jigger, I'll measure my simple syrup first and go ahead and pour that into the tin. I tend to pour it into my larger tin. A lot of people prefer to pour into their smaller tin. I don't know, maybe on another Zoom call we can talk about the differences between that. Pouring the citrus in second means that I'm also kind of rinsing whatever excess sugar might be sticking in my jigger with that nice little rinse of citrus. And then we'll finish with our 2 ounces of El Dorado.
Harmon, to answer your question about how do you stop your hands from freezing, you don't. Your hands get very cold for like a hot second, but at the same time, not really. Like, you're actually around where your hand is, it stays non-frosted and frosts sort of everywhere around it. You know, it's like your hand provides enough warmth, but like, you know, sometimes you get cold, but your heart rate's pumping, you know, you're moving, you're making lots of drinks or whatever.
I find as well, like being able to touch the tin and feel when it's getting properly cold is going to be one of your primary indications that daiquiri is probably getting where you want it to go.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about dilution and temperature, and those two things are perhaps never more important than they are in a daiquiri, and I would argue something like a martini as well. You can't have one without the other. The dilution is important to the drink, the temperature is important to the drink, and that dilution is only going to come as the temperature begins to lower and your ice begins to melt. I have sort of like a basic square, kind of mimicking like a cold draft situation mold here, which is going to be perfect for shaking. And I tend to use for a lot of drinks. If I'm doing highballs, this is a great, you know, serving ice as well. The short answer about ice is that any type of ice, any shape is going to get you to where you want to go. But the more surface area that the ice has, the faster it's going to dilute. So you could make a daiquiri with crushed ice, but it's going to melt so fast that there's a good chance you're going to get an overwatered drink before you get to the temperature that you want. And you're not going to have a lot of room to control that process as it goes. We could use a big piece of ice like Adam used in his old fashioned. And a lot of bartenders feel that that gives a really excellent texture to a shaken drink, but it also means that it's not going to dilute as quickly, and it's going to have to be a harder and a longer shake, which can help physically.
It's very common, you know, if you're using big ice, you'll see a bartender, so if they're using a big ice cube or that cold draft ice that I keep mentioning, you know, and you know, it's this perfect 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch cube that's really dense, no air, so it's dilute slowly. You'll see them crack it in their hand and then put it into their mixing glass, or maybe crack a few ice cubes at the bottom and then pack the top of it with ice, just to kind of help expedite the dilution, or else we're going to be sitting there all day and you need your drink and I got more drinks to make. So
So I kept my coupe in the freezer. You know, I could have put this in like a minute ago and it would have been properly cold. I think especially as most of us are living in hot New York apartments right now, starting with the chilled glass is even more important. We're gonna go to all this trouble of shaking this daiquiri and getting it to a nice cool temperature. And the second we put it in a warm glass, we're kind of like fighting ourselves. So it's nice if you can start with something chilled, and it only takes a second. The stemmed glassware is nice too, because as you drink it, you're gonna be holding onto the stem and not the body of the glass, depending on how saucy you are at that point, which is also gonna help maintain a cooler temperature longer as you drink this drink, which hopefully shouldn't take too long because the daiquiri is meant to be enjoyed right away. So I put my ice in the opposite tin of the one that I put my liquid, and now I'm gonna put these puppies together. Now you'll see they're kind of meeting on one side and gapped at the other. This is gonna help give it a nice tight seal. Generally speaking, I like to give it one quick shake just to make sure that everything's holding together the way that I want.
Because sometimes it's not holding together, and if that other glass happens to be a pint glass and it goes out of that, I mean, I've watched people go one time and it just goes straight back and hits the back bar and goes everywhere.
That happens with tins too, and
happens to the best of us.
So, you know, make sure it's nice and tight. And then generally speaking, if you're doing this in front of an audience, turn to the side. Don't shake right at them for that very same reason. If this tin slips out of your hands, you don't want to punch someone in the face with your tin. You know, worst case scenario this way, you're throwing it off to the side and probably getting a lot of daiquiri on yourself. You'll smell delicious afterwards, I know from experience. So I'm going to do this with 2 hands. I certainly know bartenders that shake with one, but I think especially in the beginning, as you're getting used to shaking and the strength of the shake to make it efficient, 2 hands are better than one. It also helps you keep a better grip on your tin. So one sort of at the top where they're meeting, just to make sure that that seal stays nice and tight, and one at the bottom to help control my shake. And then I don't want to start with a crazy vigorous shake, because this difference between the temperature of the ice and the warmer liquid is going to want to crack that ice. And again, as we talked about, the smaller the pieces of ice, the faster they're going to melt, and you can't control the dilution as well that way. So I want to just temper it a little bit with a couple of brief shakes just to get everything, you know, integrated together, let that ice meet that rum. And then I'm going to go to a harder shake. And don't be afraid to shake this thing. A vigorous shake is what's going to make an efficient exchange between the heat and the dilution and all the things you want going on for a nice cold daiquiri.
And I can tell you, I mean, and usually when you're say you're at a bar and you're taking a look at your tickets that are coming in as these drinks are coming in, and you have a bunch of stirred drinks and you have a bunch of shaken drinks. Is it correct to say that the stirred drinks are usually executed and poured first, because this action that you're doing is such a vigorous action, and the temperature changes and dilution happens so fast, you know, that to do this first, your drink would be dying. It would no longer be smiling at you.
You also when you finish shaking, you'll have if you do it right, if you're thinking, besides that lovely quote, there's also, another one, but I think is from either also Harry Miguel or maybe the Savoy, where you're saying that it's David Embry from the 40s. He said that when you're shaking a drink, you want to wake it up, not rock it to sleep. So you want to really have some vigor in there. You should wind up with kind of a froth or a foam of kind of a head on the top of the cocktail. If you let it sit there and die after you've shaken it, it'll kind of fall apart. Your shaken drink, your served up drink is at its peak right when you finish shaking it.
Amanda, what is the key to separating the 2 tins so easily like you just did? They will always get stuck and I can't get them apart because I'm terrible.
Well, I promise you that happens to the best of people, usually when you're in front of people and it makes you look like you've never shaken a drink before in your life. I know a lot of bartenders, you essentially, you created a bit of a vacuum in that tin, right? So you really need to have like a forceful break of that seal that you created. For me, the way that I do it is I always push to the side, one of the opposite sides from where the tins are meeting. So I'm doing a little bit of a left or a right crack. I certainly know people that like to use the base of their hands to sort of force that crack as well. The colder the tin and the more ice that's in there, the harder it's going to be to break it. So sometimes it's going to cause you trouble no matter what, but you definitely have to be forceful and try to break that seal right at the point where it's created. Doing it higher up on the tin doesn't always give you a lot of leverage.
You don't have much control up there either. Harman, what I usually tell people is, if you find the point where the joint is, where Amanda's pointing out that the tins are connecting, kind of the backbone of it there, go on to the exact opposite side, because when you hit over there, you'll have a pressure point, and when you put pressure on that side, the seal will pop.
And the ketchup comes out.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Whereas
Now,
if you hit it on the joint, it could very easily, you want to control, it could very easily go flying away from you. Again.
so when you're finished, in a perfect world, I don't know if you guys can see this, you shouldn't have ice that's busted into a million pieces. You should have ice, if you're using these larger cubes, that just kind of like you've shaved off the corners and really like done a good job of integrating those things together. And then as I pour, another way that you can sort of help with the liveliness of the drink is to do a bit of a higher pour and give it that last little bit of aeration right before you serve it, which is quite nice. Also, don't ignore the liquid that you're going to find in your opposite tin. Even though I'm straining from this one, there's going to be some residual delicious daiquiri on the edges, inner edges of this tin. So usually when I crack them, I like to at least pour that little bit back in to make sure I get all the goodness out.
And how about the strainer itself? Did that strainer you use matter?
So, you know, generally speaking, we're going to have bartenders hanging on to a julep strainer, which is this guy here, and a hawthorn strainer, which has the coils. I would argue that if you only had one strainer, the hawthorn strainer is the one that makes the most difference. You'll certainly have bartenders that, you know, have really strong opinions about which one you use for the certain type of drink. The idea being that this coil is not only going to hold back those tiny chips of ice that you may not want in your finished product, but it's also going to help with aeration as well. This julep strainer, on the other hand, for something silky and sexy like a martini or a Manhattan, isn't going to create the same amount of aeration, and you shouldn't have the small pieces of ice that you had in a shake and drink anyway when you're using you know, a vessel for stirring.
So Amanda, I noticed that you did not double strain by using that little strainer, which some people do. So do you have any little ice bits, like little chippies that you're going to chew on floating at the top there? And
I probably did a second ago, but I have a feeling the temperature in this apartment is a little bit. That tends to be a point of argument as well. Some bartenders are really big fans of that fine layer of tiny chips of ice on top, which you can really achieve if you've shaken something really well and haven't abused the ice in your tin too much. Other people don't want that texture at all. I'm actually, for a long time, it was my habit to double strain with the tea strainer all of my shaken up drinks. Certainly if you're muddling something like cucumber or mint, you're going to want to double strain because the hawthorn strainer alone isn't going to be enough to keep all of that particulate from going into your glass. But beyond that, it might be a point of preference and also a mark of how efficiently you're shaking. In the beginning, if you're not sure that you're not controlling the dilution too well, then you might want to double strain to keep bigger chunks of ice out of your drink. Of course, if we were serving this on the rocks, which we definitely could, you know, maybe those bits of ice matter even less. So a lot of it comes down to personal preference.
I think it's also, before we move on to a spritz, you know, it's also worth noting, like, this is where this drink starts. You know, it's easy at this point to add an egg white, and you want to talk about aeration. Now you have some leavening inside that glass beyond just a little bit of froth. You know, you could also plan ahead of time and overcompensate with sugar and acid, knowing that you're going to then add some sort of lengthener like soda or something else, some bubbles, so that way this drink becomes even taller and more quaffable to lighten, more sessionable to lighten the drink up.
And certainly something like lime juice will have some nice texture. Nothing has texture as gorgeous as pineapple juice. If you like using pineapple juice for mixing, you'll get a really beautiful head on these types of shaken up drinks every time, which is pretty sexy.
What do you think, Justin?
And I like
Big segue. I love it.
split facing mine with an agricole rum and a molasses rum. Personally, that's just.
So a quick note about mixing rums, and then we'll move on to the spritz because we're definitely over on time. I was really intimidated when I first started making cocktails about the idea of combining rums together, but it turns out that it's really hard to mess it up. I mean, you can certainly end up with drinks that maybe aren't to your personal taste or maybe are overwhelming in a flavor you didn't mean them to be. Certainly, if you have a rum that starts more dry, you might want to add more sugar to that daiquiri, or you can end up with something that's too dry. But if you've got a Jamaican rum and you really love how funky it is, but you don't want your whole daiquiri to be crazy full of funk, you know, take that 2 ounces of your base rum that you're using in the template and switch out a 1/4 ounce of it for an unaged Jamaican or a little bit of an agricole. You can start seasoning the rums that you're adding into that base until you find combinations that you really like and end up with some really surprising and awesome flavor combinations.